For nearly a decade, Rick stood beside his father in front of millions of viewers around the world. The world saw the
The
jokes,
audience could
the
not
argument.
see. Now at 61, Rick is finally breaking his silence. Not just about the music disease that slowly took his father. Not just about those final days at home, but about the things he should have said, the moments he missed, and the secret the family quietly kept for years. Richard Benjamin Harrison Jr. was born on March 4, 1941 in Danville, Virginia, and he grew up in Lexington, North Carolina, a small mill town where the future felt narrow from the start. Money was always tight. As a teenager, he even drove a school bus for just $5 to $6 a week to help his family get by. In a place like Lexington, most people saw only two real options ahead of them. You either joined the military or you went into the cotton mill. Neither path promised comfort, and neither offered much room to dream. So while other boys were still figuring out who they wanted to be, Richard was already learning a harder lesson. If he wanted a different life, he would have to fight for it. That pressure followed him into his school years, and before long, staying in class no longer felt possible. Richard dropped out of Lexington High School during his junior year because his family needed money right away. He was not sitting around doing nothing. He was music, chasing work wherever he could find it, taking odd jobs, moving from one hustle to the next, and trying to bring home cash in a town where stable work was scarce and wages were painfully low. Life kept pushing him forward, but it never really gave him solid ground. That constant strain shaped him early. He became the kind of person who believed survival came first, and everything else had to wait. By the time he was 17, that survival music instinct had already turned reckless. He stole a car, got arrested, and ended up standing in front of a North Carolina judge who gave him a music life-changing choice. He could go to prison or he could join the military. Richard chose the Navy. It was a desperate decision, but it changed everything that came after. In October 1958, still music, just 17 years old, he enlisted and was sent to boot camp in San Diego. Only hours after taking his Navy recruitment test, he was already on a plane, leaving North Carolina behind. Soon after that, he was assigned to the USS Orleck as a deckhand working in the ship's laundry. It was humble work. He scrubbed uniforms, music, handled endless chores, and started at the very bottom. Still, for the first time in a long while, his life had direction. That direction became even more important when family responsibilities arrived. In 1960, Richard married his hometown sweetheart, JoAnn Rue. Then life got heavier. Their first baby, Sherry JoAnn Harrison, was born with Down syndrome and needed expensive specialized care. Richard finished his first Navy stretch and left the service in February 1962. But the financial music pressure waiting for him on the outside hit hard just 14 months later. In 1963, he re-enlisted because the medical bills were too much to carry. He later said it plainly. He could not afford the care. So he and his wife talked it over, and he went back into the Navy. That choice kept him in uniform for a total of 20 years. It also showed exactly what kind of man he had become. He was no longer a boy trying to escape trouble. He was a father. Music, making himself carry what his family needed. From 1958 to 1979, Richard Benjamin Harrison lived a hard Navy life that stretched across most of his adulthood. He served on 4 different ships, worked with the destroyer squadron staff, joined a tactical air squadron, and completed 1 shore tour. Out of those 20 years, about 14 were spent at sea. That meant cramped sleeping quarters, long stretches away from home, rough water, strict routines, and a life ruled by the ship's clock. Over time, he rose to personnel first class, a senior enlisted rank that demanded discipline, patience, and attention to detail. The Navy did not soften him. It hardened him. It taught him to stay steady, to work without complaint, and to keep moving even when the days felt endless. His service left marks that many people never noticed later on. His medals included the Good Conduct Medal, the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal, and the National Defense Service Medal. Those ribbons showed that he had served during real military operations in some of the tensest years of the era. Yet when millions of people later watched him on television, most of them had no idea. On Pawn Stars, he rarely spoke about any of it. Viewers' music, saw a gruff old shop owner with sharp opinions and a dry voice. What they did not always see was the veteran behind that face, a man shaped by decades of service and long years spent far from home. Eventually, though, even that life had to end. Richard retired from the Navy in 1979, and the reason was deeply personal. By then, he and Joan had 3 teenage sons, and life at home had become too much for one parent to handle alone. In an interview, he said it with the blunt honesty people later came to know him for. The wife could not handle them. Behind that line was a serious decision. He walked away from the only structured life he music had known for 2 decades because his family needed him on land. It meant leaving G behind steady pay, a familiar system, and a clear path forward. Once again, he was stepping into uncertainty because home came first. That next chapter did not begin with instant success. After retiring, Richard and Joan moved into real estate in San Diego, which looked promising at first. The field was booming in the mid-1970s, and for a while it seemed like they had found the right opening. Then the economy shifted. Interest rates climbed to crushing levels, reaching around 18% in the early 1980s, and suddenly buyers disappeared. The business collapsed fast. Harrison later said the crash cost them about $1 million. For a retired enlisted sailor, that was not a music setback you could shrug off. It wiped out years of effort and left the family facing another painful restart. So in April 1981, with only about $5,000 left, the Harrisons packed up their 3 sons and drove from San Diego to Las Vegas, chasing the kind of chance people go there to find. He called it the land of milk and honey. What they found was not easy money, but it was a place where a stubborn family could build again. He opened a tiny coin shop at 1501 Las Vegas Boulevard. The space was only 300 square feet, barely enough room to breathe, but it gave them a beginning. Rick joined him, and together they slowly expanded from coins into second-hand goods. Years later, after finally securing a pawn license, when the city passed 250,000 music residents, they opened the gold and silver pawn shop in 1989. What later became famous started in a cramped little store with very little money behind it and a great deal of pressure on every choice they made. Rick Harrison's story began before that shop became known to anyone. He was born on March 22, 1965 in Lexington, North Carolina, the same hometown as his father. His early years were shaped by severe epilepsy, which began around age 8. The seizures were serious enough to leave him stuck in bed for days at a time, and those long absences broke up any sense of a normal childhood. School became difficult. Sports faded into the background. Music, social life often slipped away before it could even begin. Yet in that isolation, something important started to grow. Since he spent so much time alone, Rick turned toward books, especially history. What began as a way to pass the time, music, slowly became the foundation of the mind people would later see on screen. As those bed-bound music days piled up, he read more and more. And not casually, either. He read obsessively. Music. One of the series that stuck with him was The Great Brain, about a clever boy in 1800s Utah who was always dreaming up schemes, finding angles, and figuring out how people work. That mix of storytelling, psychology, music, and deal-making got deep into Rick's head. It sharpened the way he thought years later, when he could look at rare coins, Civil War weapons, old books, or strange historical objects, and instantly begin talking about them with detail and confidence. Those childhood reading habits were part of the reason his knowledge did not come from polished classrooms. It came from long hours alone reading because he had little else to do, and eventually realizing he loved it. His formal education did not last long. Rick dropped out of high school during his sophomore year, and around the same time, life sped up in a way that forced him to grow up fast. By age 16, he had already become a father. That changed the way he looked at everything. Suddenly, there was no room for drifting. There was no diploma in hand, no safety net, and now there was a child depending on him. He has said that this was the moment reality truly hit. From then on, making steady money stopped being an idea and became an urgent need. That urgency became even sharper after the families moved to Las Vegas in the early 1980s. They had arrived there after financial trouble destroyed his parents' real estate business, carrying only about $5,000 with them. Richard opened the small coin shop, But Rick's mind locked onto something bigger. Music. Las Vegas had a city rule that limited pawn licenses to 25, with one extra license becoming available only when the population reached 250,000. Music. Rick saw that rule as an opening. Starting in 1987, he called the city music statistician every week to track the numbers. Week after week, he kept checking. Then, in April 1988, the city finally crossed 250,000 music residents. Rick rushed to City Hall and secured the new pawn license for just $50. It was a tiny fee tied to a huge opportunity, and he moved quickly enough to claim Music. That single move changed the family business forever. With the license in hand, Rick and his father opened a gold and silver pawn shop on Las Vegas Boulevard in 1988, then moved it in 1989 to the now famous address at 713 Las Vegas Boulevard South. Right from the start, they ran it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, matching the nonstop pace of Las Vegas itself. The brutal schedule reflected the family's mindset. Work came first, rest came later. Rick has said music, that this approach came straight from his father's Navy years, from those 20 years in uniform and the roughly 14 spent at sea. Richard had learned how to keep going no matter what, and that same rhythm got built into the shop. Over time, the business became far more than a small family store. By 2005, just 16 years after opening in 1989, Gold and Silver Pawn had turned into a serious financial machine. The shop was issuing about $3 million in loans music every year, and interest earnings alone had reached around $700,000 annually. For a business that began as a risky fresh start after financial ruin, that kind of growth music was huge. Pawn loans in Nevada often carried high monthly interest, so even smaller items could produce strong return. That music, steady flow of money gave Rick room to reinvest, expand, and keep building without depending on banks. As the business grew, Rick also made a choice that set the shop apart. Many pawn shops filled their shelves with used televisions, common jewelry, and ordinary household goods. Rick pushed in a different direction. He leaned into historical items and objects with real stories behind them. The store began featuring samurai swords, rare firearms, old coins, and first edition books. That shift changed the energy of the place. Collectors came in. Historians paid attention. Tourists started treating the shop almost like an attraction. What had once been a local business began to feel like a mix of retail space and informal museum, and that unusual identity made it far more memorable than a typical pawn shop. By 2005, only 16 years after Gold and Silver Pawn opened in 1989, the business had become far more than a small family shop trying to survive in a rough part of Las Vegas. It was now producing real money at scale. The shop was issuing about $3 million in loans every year, and the interest alone was bringing in around $700,000 annually. That kind of income changed everything, because pawn loans in Nevada often carried monthly interest rates of 10 to 20%. Even ordinary items could turn into strong returns. So, while the outside music still looked like a gritty local pawn shop, inside it was becoming a powerful cash machine. That steady stream of money gave Rick Harrison room to grow on his own term. He did not need to depend on banks. He could reinvest, expand, and keep building. As the money grew, Rick made a move that separated his shop from almost music, every other pawn business in the city. Instead of filling the place with used televisions, low-end jewelry, and the usual forgotten household stuff, he leaned harder into rare and historic pieces. Suddenly, the shelves and counters held samurai swords, old firearms, ancient coins, and first edition books. That decision changed the whole feeling of the shop. It also changed the kind of people walking through the door. Collectors started coming in. Historians showed up. Museums took notice. Tourists began reading the store like a stop they had to see, not just a place where people pawned belongings for quick cash. Little by little, Gold and Silver Pawn started to feel part business, part attraction, part unofficial museum. In that world, Rick was not just a pawnbroker anymore. He was becoming the man who knew how to turn history into profit. That reputation grew even stronger because Rick had a gift that gave him an edge in a city built on risk. People began calling him the spotter because he could look at an item and sense something was off almost immediately. He says that skill came from the way he spent his childhood. Because he was often stuck indoors, he read constantly. He buried himself in history, music prices, manufacturing details, and how things were made. Over time, that reading turned into instinct in Las Vegas, where fake signatures, altered antiques, and shady stories could show up any day. That instinct was worth a fortune. He could catch a counterfeit, question a strange backstory, or notice a detail others missed within minutes. That protected the shop from legal trouble, but it also did something even more valuable. It gave customers a reason to trust him. In an industry that often carried a bad reputation, Rick came to be seen as sharp, informed, and dependable. Once he had built that kind of business, he began chasing a much bigger idea. Rick believed a pawn shop could work on television. Almost everyone else thought that was ridiculous. Networks turned him down. People AR,